Brothers vanished in 1966. 58 years later, a locked shed was finally opened. The hinges screeched like something alive as the rusted lock cracked open, and the heavy wooden doors groaned apart. For decades, that shed had sat quietly on the far end of a forgotten property, its windows nailed shut, its boards weathered gray by sun and rain. Children in the neighborhood whispered about it, daring each other to run past at night, swearing that they saw shadows behind the warped slats. Adults avoided talking about it at all. And yet, on a chilly autumn morning in 2024, a county worker slid a crowbar into the rusted clasp and pushed the doors wide. What spilled out wasn't just dust and stale air, but a story that had haunted the town for over half a century. Inside that shed, in the stillness of cobwebs and mildew, was the answer to a question that had hung like a ghost since 1966. What happened to the two brothers who disappeared on a warm summer afternoon and never came home? But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. The year was 1966. America was in the throes of change. Young men were being sent off to Vietnam. Music drifted from every radio, from the Beatles to the Beach Boys. Families gathered around black and white televisions, watching Walter Cronkite tell them the world's latest troubles. But in small rural towns, life still moved at a slower rhythm. Summer meant children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, mothers hung laundry on clotheslines that snapped in the wind, and neighbors left their front doors unlocked. It was in one such town, tucked between rolling fields and a sluggish river, that the two brothers lived. They weren't rich, but they weren't destitute either. Their father worked long hours at the mill, his hands perpetually lined with grease, his shirts always carrying the smell of metal and oil. Their mother kept the household running with the same devotion she gave to her garden, where she grew tomatoes, beans, and tall rows of corn that swayed like sentinels in the summer breeze. The boys were the center of her world. The older brother, just shy of 13, had the kind of restless energy that couldn't be tamed. He dreamed of one day leaving town, of playing baseball in front of cheering crowds, or maybe even seeing California, which sounded as exotic as another planet. The younger brother, only 10, was quieter, more thoughtful. He trailed after his older sibling like a shadow, content to follow wherever adventure might lead. Together, they were inseparable. Neighbors often said that when you saw one boy, you knew the other wasn't far behind. If one came asking for a sandwich, you could be sure the second would be leaning on the fence within minutes, waiting with a grin. They shared everything, from comic books to pocket knives, and the older one carried a protective streak, always making sure his little brother was safe. That summer of 1966 was unusually hot, the kind of heat that baked the sidewalks and made the tar on the roads soft enough to stick to the soles of your shoes. The boys spent most of their days outside, chasing each other with squirt guns, fishing by the river, or sneaking into the edge of the woods to build makeshift forts out of fallen branches. But it was on a particular day in late June that everything changed. The morning had started like any other. Their mother remembered packing them sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, reminding them to be back before dinner. The boys ran out the door, their laughter echoing down the street. That was the last time she ever saw them alive. When they didn't return by dusk, she first assumed they'd lost track of time. It happened often, but as the sky turned from pink to deep indigo and the cicadas droned louder in the trees, a knot of worry tightened in her chest. By the time their father returned from the mill, sweat and grime coating his face, the worry had bloomed into full panic. That night would mark the beginning of a nightmare that stretched for nearly 6 decades. The town turned upside down. Flashlights swept through cornfields. Neighbors called out the boys' names into the thick summer air. Dogs barked as men searched the woods, their voices carrying into the night. And yet, there was nothing. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, not even a broken branch to suggest where the brothers had gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. For years, the shed stood at the far end of that property, silent and overlooked. People whispered, but no one dared break its lock. Some claimed it was empty. Others said they heard noises late at night, like chains dragging on the floor. Children told each other ghost stories, swearing that if you pressed your ear against the door, you could hear faint knocking from inside. But the truth, the awful, undeniable truth, would remain hidden until 2024. And when the doors finally opened, the smell hit first. Damp wood, rust, and something else, something sharp, metallic, and sour. the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and follows you home. What they found inside would rewrite everything the town thought it knew about that summer day in 1966. To understand the weight of that shed being opened nearly 60 years later, you have to picture the world the brothers lived in. 1966 was a year of contrasts. The nation was buzzing with change, but small towns like theirs seemed to exist in a bubble, clinging to a simpler way of life. The town itself wasn't much more than a collection of streets that cut through farmland. A diner sat at the corner of Main, its neon sign flickering even in daylight. On Saturday mornings, kids pedaled their bikes past the grocery, balancing paper bags full of bread and milk for their mothers. On Sundays, the church bells carried over the rooftops, summoning nearly every family in town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, where gossip traveled faster than the summer wind, and where trouble was usually nothing more than a fender bender or a fight after too many beers. But beneath the surface, there were tensions too. The war overseas weighed heavy. Families watched their boys drafted, their names called out in newspapers. Mothers cried quietly in church pews. Fathers who worked at the mill whispered about strikes, about wages that never stretched far enough. Even in a sleepy place like this, the world's troubles seeped in. And yet, for children like the two brothers, those burdens didn't exist. Their world was the dirt roads, the swimming hole, and the woods that seemed to go on forever. The older boy had a sharp grin and a stubborn streak. He loved baseball and carried his glove everywhere, even when no one else was playing. He'd throw rocks into the air just to practice catching, his hands snapping shut with the precision of someone who dreamed of bigger things. Teachers called him a daydreamer, but his friends saw him as the leader of every game, every adventure. The younger brother had softer features and a quiet way about him. He'd sit cross-legged on the porch, flipping through comic books, lost in worlds of heroes and villains. He was more cautious, more thoughtful, but he adored his older brother and followed him without hesitation. Together, they were like two halves of the same whole. Their home was modest but warm, a 2-story farmhouse with paint peeling around the windowsills and a screen door that slammed no matter how carefully you tried to close it. Their mother decorated the kitchen with little touches, a vase of wildflowers on the table, curtains she had sewn herself. The air often smelled of fresh bread cooling on the counter or the faint, sharp tang of tomatoes simmering for sauce. Their father wasn't home much during the day, but when he returned, his laughter could be heard clear across the yard, booming and warm despite the long hours he put in. Neighbors remember the family fondly. The mother had a gentle smile, the kind that made you feel welcome. The father was quieter but respected, known for fixing things for folks who couldn't afford the repairman. And the boys, well, everyone knew them. They were the type who left their bikes leaning against fences, their shoes muddy from cutting across fields, their pockets filled with marbles or frogs they caught by the creek. That June was sweltering. The days stretched long, filled with cicadas that droned so loudly you almost forgot silence existed. Children gathered at the river, stripping down to splash in the cool water, their laughter echoing through the trees. Nights were sticky, the air thick enough that fans ran in every window. People slept with screens propped open, praying for a breeze. The brothers thrived in that summer heat. They woke early, wolfed down toast and eggs, and bolted out the door before their mother could remind them to wear hats against the Sunday. Their bare feet slapped against the dirt, their voices carrying down the street as they planned the day's adventure. One morning, a neighbor recalled seeing them carrying fishing poles, their heads bent close in conversation. Another said they were spotted later that same day, pedaling their bikes toward the edge of town, dust kicking up behind them. Small memories, fragments of an ordinary day, ones that became painfully important later when people tried to piece together every step they had taken. The truth is, no one thought twice about them being gone all afternoon. This was the 1960s, in a town where children roamed free. Parents didn't hover, didn't track every movement. They trusted their kids would be home by supper, dirty and tired but safe. That was the rhythm of life, and for years it had been enough. But as the sun set on that particular June day, unease began to creep in. The boy's mother set plates on the table, glancing out the window every few minutes, expecting to see two familiar figures trudging up the road. She poured sweet tea, the condensation dripping down the glass pitcher, but her hands shook slightly. The food grew cold. The dog whined at the door, and the street outside remained empty. When the father returned from the mill, still in his work boots, the look on his wife's face told him everything. Without a word, He grabbed his flashlight and headed out, calling the boys' names into the thick night air. His voice grew hoarse. Neighbors soon joined in, their own flashlights cutting through the darkness, beams sweeping over fields and ditches. That night marked the shift. A town that had always felt safe suddenly felt fragile. Parents pulled their children closer. The woods that once promised adventure now loomed with menace. And in the silence of their farmhouse, the brothers' mother sat awake until dawn, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for shapes that never appeared. Looking back, people remember the atmosphere of that summer with a strange clarity. The smell of cut grass mingling with gasoline from lawnmowers, the sound of radios playing hits that seemed too cheerful for the growing fear, the taste of homemade ice cream at church socials, somehow dulled by the whispered worry in every conversation. It was still, outwardly, a normal summer. But for one family, and eventually for an entire community, it became the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across decades. Because the brothers didn't just run late. They didn't simply wander too far. They vanished, leaving behind a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. And somewhere, on the edge of that quiet town, a shed stood locked and waiting. It was a Saturday, the 25th of June, 1966. The day started bright and hot, with a sun that burned away the morning mist before the church bells finished their chime. The air was thick, humming with cicadas, the kind of heat that made tar bubble on the roads and kids run barefoot across lawns just to avoid burning their souls on the pavement. Inside the family's kitchen, the boys ate quickly, barely sitting still long enough to finish the buttered toast their mother had set before them. The older one chattered about catching the biggest fish in the river, making a show of flexing his thin arm and grinning like he was already a champion angler. The younger one laughed and nodded, his wide eyes fixed on his brother as though every word were gospel. Their mother reminded them to stay away from the old quarry. She always said it, every time they went out, as if repeating it might keep them safe. The older boy rolled his eyes and promised, just like he always did, while the younger one gave a solemn nod. By 10 in the morning, they were out the door. Their fishing poles bounced on their shoulders, and a paper sack of sandwiches dangled from the younger boy's hand. The screen door banged shut behind them with that sharp, familiar slap, and their mother called out for them to be home before supper. They didn't look back. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was hanging laundry on her line when she saw them pass. She remembered later that the older boy's shirt was striped, blue and white, while the younger wore a faded red one with the hem unraveling. She had waved, and the boys waved back, their laughter carrying across the yard as they cut through an alleyway toward the fields. That was the last confirmed sighting anyone could agree on. From there, the details blur. One man swore he saw them down by the riverbank, skipping stones. Another claimed they pedaled their bikes toward the edge of town, near the woods. But memories are slippery things, and as the days turned into weeks, what people thought they remembered became tangled with rumor and fear. What is certain is that by late afternoon, the brothers had not returned home. Their mother kept glancing at the clock. The hands crept toward 6, the hour she always had dinner ready, but the boys' chairs sat empty. She checked the yard, the street, even the neighbor's porch, but there was no sign of them. She set their plates anyway, unable to break the ritual. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes, the roast chicken sat waiting, but the food grew colder by the minute. The dog scratched at the back door, whining, as if sensing something was off. When the sun began to sink, her unease sharpened into something else. The cicadas grew louder, their buzzing almost frantic, as though even nature was unsettled. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the golden glare, scanning the road that stretched past their house. Still nothing. By the time her husband came home, dusk had begun to spread across the sky. His boots hit the porch heavy, and he knew something was wrong the moment he saw her face. "They're not back," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Without hesitation, he grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, its metal casing cold and dented from years of use. He strode into the yard, calling their names, his voice echoing across fields now thick with shadows. Neighbors heard the calls and came out to help. Soon, flashlights bobbed through the darkness like fireflies, sweeping across rows of corn, over fences, into ditches. The beams cut through the tall grass, illuminating nothing but startled rabbits and rustling weeds. By midnight, the search had grown frantic. Mothers kept their own children close, watching from porches with worried eyes. Men carried lanterns, their voices rough with exhaustion and fear as they shouted the boys' names again and again. The riverbank was combed, the woods searched. Dogs sniffed through brush, their barking ringing into the night. But there was nothing. No fishing poles, no bicycles, no scraps of clothing caught on a branch. The brothers had vanished as though the earth had swallowed them whole. Back at the house, their mother sat by the window, her face pale in the glow of the porch light. On the table behind her, the plates of food had gone untouched, flies already buzzing near the edges. The silence inside the home was unbearable, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling. That first night stretched endlessly. The father didn't return until dawn, his flashlight dimming, his face set in a grim mask. He hadn't found them. No one had. The following morning, the town buzzed with whispers. Some said the boys had run off, maybe to the city, chasing some adventure. Others thought they'd drowned in the river, though no bodies were found. A few muttered darker theories, the kind people hesitate to speak aloud in daylight. But one fact was clear. 2 brothers had walked out the door on a Saturday morning in June, and by nightfall, they had disappeared. And somewhere, far at the edge of town, a shed sat locked and waiting, its secrets sealed for nearly 60 years. The first 24 hours are always the hardest, they say, the ones that decide everything. But back in 1966, people didn't speak of such things the way they do now. There were no round-the-clock news channels, no Amber Alerts, no awareness campaigns drilling into parents' heads that every minute counts. In that quiet town, panic was something that came slowly, like a fog rolling in, until you couldn't see where you were standing anymore. For the boy's mother, panic began the moment the sun sank that first night, and their bed sat empty. She had paced the hallway in bare feet, pressing her ear to the silence as though she might catch the sound of footsteps outside. Every few minutes she returned to the window, straining her eyes toward the dark road. Her hands trembled as she pulled their jackets from the hooks by the door, clutching them to her chest as though holding the fabric could keep the boys close. Her husband, meanwhile, searched until dawn. His flashlight beam cut across fields and ditches until his arms ached from holding it steady. His boots sank into the soft earth by the riverbank as he scanned the water's edge, calling their names until his throat was raw. Every snapping branch made his heart jump, every rustle in the brush turned his stomach. But again and again, it was nothing. By sunrise, he trudged home empty-handed, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. His wife met him on the porch, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice hoarse from whispering prayers into the night. He didn't have to say the words. The answer was written in his silence. That morning, the search widened. Neighbors came with coffee in hand, ready to join. Men carried lanterns and rifles, women brought food to keep the searchers going, and children whispered to each other in hushed tones, sensing the weight of what was happening. The sheriff was called, though some said he arrived reluctantly, convinced at first that the boys had simply run off on some childish adventure. But as the hours passed, the town's unease deepened. Posters were hastily made, hand-drawn sketches of the brothers with descriptions scribbled underneath. Brown hair, blue eyes, thin build, last seen wearing a striped shirt and a faded red one. The pages were tacked to telephone poles, taped to shop windows, pinned to the church bulletin board. The boys' names were on every tongue, spoken in worried tones, muttered in prayers, whispered like a plea against the rising fear. Their mother, meanwhile, could not sit still. She scoured their bedroom, running her hands over their blankets, lifting their pillows as though she might find some clue hidden beneath. She checked their dresser drawers, their pockets, even the floorboards under the bed. She clung to small details, a marble left on the nightstand, a comic book folded open to a favorite page, a baseball glove lying limp on the floor, the leather still warm from the last time it had been worn. She clutched those things like lifelines, as though the boys had left behind a trail that only she could follow. Her husband was different. He grew quieter, the lines around his eyes deepening as though years were carved into him overnight. He spoke little, but his actions were relentless. He joined every search party, trudged through every ditch, combed every cornfield until his legs nearly gave out. When the sheriff finally suggested that perhaps the boys had run away, he nearly exploded. "They're just children," he barked. "They didn't run away. Someone took them." The sheriff didn't argue, but his silence said enough. In a town like theirs, the idea of someone taking children was unthinkable. It was easier, perhaps, to believe the boys had wandered off or gotten lost, but the parents knew better. They felt it in their bones, in the pit of their stomachs, in the quiet certainty that comes from knowing your own children's hearts. As night fell again, the second without the boys, The farmhouse felt unbearably empty. The dog paced the floor, whining at the door. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the uneaten meal, now spoiled. The mother sat at the table with her head in her hands, the father beside her, staring at the wall as though sheer willpower might bring his sons walking through the door. That night, neither of them slept. In town, the gossip began. Some whispered about strangers passing through. A man in a truck who'd been seen on the highway. A drifter spotted near the train tracks. Others spoke of accidents. The river was deep and unpredictable, they said. The woods stretched on for miles, easy to get lost in. And then there were the darker whispers, spoken only when children were out of earshot. Words like kidnapping, murder, evil. But in the farmhouse, there was no need for whispers. The family felt the truth pressing in. Something had happened, something terrible. The third day brought reporters. A local paper ran the story with the headline, "Two brothers, missing, town in shock." A black and white photo of the boys was printed, their faces smiling, innocent, frozen in time. The article spoke of search parties, of community worry, of a sheriff doing his best. But beneath the words, the fear was plain. The brothers were gone, and no one knew why. For the parents, every hour stretched like an eternity. The mother found herself listening for sounds that never came: the creak of the screen door, the thud of running feet, the burst of laughter echoing through the yard. She sat on the edge of their beds, inhaling the faint smell of grass and sweat still clinging to the sheets, rocking gently as though her sons were still there. Her husband, meanwhile, grew harder. He said little, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. He began to look at neighbors differently, at strangers with suspicion. He carried his rifle more often, even just walking to the barn. Something in him had shifted. And so, the panic that had begun as fear deepened into something heavier. It became grief mixed with desperation, the kind that eats at a family from the inside, the kind that doesn't let go. The town prayed, the family searched, but the boys never came home. And far away, on the edge of an overgrown property, the shed sat locked, waiting. By the end of the first week, the whole town had changed. This was the kind of place where people usually left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved across yards and children darted freely between houses. But now, doors were bolted, curtains were drawn, and mothers called their children inside long before dusk. The streets grew quiet in the evenings, the air thick not only with the hum of cicadas, but with a silence that felt heavier than heat. Everywhere, the missing boys were the only topic. Their faces, once just familiar children running errands or playing ball in the park, now stared back from flyers taped to every lamppost and shop window. The black and white photographs seemed to watch from every corner, reminders that innocence could vanish in broad daylight. At the diner, conversations hushed when their parents walked in. At church, prayers for the brothers replaced the usual hymns of gratitude. Candlelight vigils were held on the courthouse steps, flames flickering in the humid night air as the crowd bowed their heads in silence. But even in those moments of unity, fear was at work. People began to look at each other differently. A neighbor who once seemed harmless suddenly became suspicious. A man driving too slowly down Main Street drew whispers. Even the drifters who passed through men with backpacks or dusty shoes were eyed with open hostility, told to keep moving before sundown. Rumors spread like wildfire. One story claimed a traveling salesman had been seen near the river the day the boys vanished. Another insisted they'd been spotted climbing into a stranger's car. Some whispered of a man in a dark coat who lingered near the schoolyard, though no one could say exactly when or if he had ever existed at all. The sheriff did his best to calm the talk, but small towns thrive on whispers, and when fear takes root, it twists every shadow into menace. Theories piled up, each one darker than the last. Some said the boys had drowned in the river, their bodies caught under the current where no one could reach them. But no one wanted to say it aloud in front of their mother, who refused to believe they were gone without proof. Others suggested they'd been kidnapped, taken far away by someone who'd been passing through. A few even muttered about more sinister things: hidden crimes, secret feuds, even curses whispered by the old women who still clung to superstition. The woods, once a place of childhood adventure, took on a different face. Parents forbade their children from playing there. Hunters spoke of strange silences, of paths that felt wrong, of birds that scattered suddenly, as if startled by something unseen. The old quarry became a site of endless speculation, its dark waters deep enough to hide anything. Searchers dragged it once, then twice, but nothing was found. Still, the whispers didn't stop. The brothers' absence became an open wound on the town, and the longer they remained missing, the more people searched for answers anywhere they could find them. Psychics came, uninvited, offering visions of where the boys might be. Some spoke of barns, others of shallow graves. One woman claimed she saw them standing in a field, calling out for help. Desperate, the family listened, though each vision led to another dead end. Then came the cruel rumors. People questioned the parents themselves. Had there been trouble at home? Arguments? Secrets? It was easier, perhaps, to blame those closest, rather than accept the possibility of a stranger lurking among them. The mother felt those stares most acutely, whispers trailing her when she walked through town. The father, once respected for his hard work, now found conversations falling silent when he entered a room. Fear eats trust, and in that summer of 1966, trust in the town was dwindling fast. The boys' absence also became a kind of presence. Children swore they saw figures moving at night near the fields. Some claimed they heard faint laughter carried on the wind, like echoes of the past. A few said if you stood near the riverbank after midnight, you could hear voices calling. Adults brushed it off as childish imagination, but even they couldn't shake the feeling that something hung in the air. By August, weeks after the disappearance, the mood had shifted from frantic searching to a kind of heavy waiting. Flyers yellowed in the Sunday. The sheriff stopped organizing daily search parties, insisting his men had covered every inch of land they could. Reporters moved on to other stories. Life resumed, at least on the surface. But the silence in that farmhouse never lifted. The boys' room remained untouched, their toys still scattered, their beds neatly made by a mother who couldn't stop herself from straightening the pillows each morning. The father grew more withdrawn, his eyes shadowed, his words fewer with each passing day. And at the edge of town, the locked shed still stood, its windows shuttered, its door secured by a heavy rusted lock. People passed it on their way to the fields, never stopping, never daring to look too closely. But the children whispered, swearing they felt something watching from behind the boards. Some dared each other to touch the door, to press an ear against the wood. Most ran away before they could. The town moved on, but uneasily. Because when children vanish, the world doesn't just return to normal. It shifts, it bends, it grows colder. And though people tried to live as they had before, something in that town had cracked open. And it would stay cracked for decades, until the day the shed was finally opened. Posters were hastily made, hand-drawn sketches of the brothers with descriptions scribbled underneath. Brown hair, blue eyes, thin build, last seen wearing a striped shirt and a faded red one. The pages were tacked to telephone poles, taped to shop windows, pinned to the church bulletin board. The boys' names were on every tongue, spoken in worried tones, muttered in prayers, whispered like a plea against the rising fear. The sheriff of that small county had seen trouble before, but nothing like this. He was a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the look of someone who'd spent a lifetime squinting against the Sunday. His job usually involved little more than breaking up bar fights, chasing the occasional chicken thief, and pulling drunks out of ditches. A missing child was rare. 2 missing children brothers, gone in broad daylight, was unheard of. At first, he treated it like any other case of kids wandering too far. Boys went missing sometimes, only to turn up a few hours later with muddy shoes and sheepish grins. But as the hours stretched into days, and as the search parties returned empty-handed again and again, his confidence began to waver. The investigation started with the basics. The river was dragged by volunteers with boats, men pulling long hooks through the dark water. They turned up driftwood, weeds, even the carcass of a deer, but no trace of the boys. The woods were combed line by line, neighbors locking arms and sweeping through undergrowth. They found beer cans, tire tracks, animal bones, nothing human. Deputies interviewed everyone who might have seen the brothers that day. Mrs. Callahan confirmed she saw them walking past with their fishing poles in the morning. A farmhand swore he glimpsed them pedaling their bicycles near the highway around noon, but his timeline shifted every time he told it. Another boy said he thought he saw them near the old quarry, but when pressed, admitted he couldn't be sure if it was the same day at all. The sheriff scribbled notes in a worn pad, but the more he collected, the less clear the story became. Witness accounts contradicted each other, memories blurred. The exact timeline of the boys' movements dissolved into a fog. And then there was the shed. It sat on a property at the far edge of town, once belonging to a reclusive farmer who had died years before. His relatives had abandoned the land, leaving it to rot. The shed stood locked, its windows nailed shut. Searchers passed it during the sweeps, but no one thought to open it. Why would they? It was just an old outbuilding, one of dozens scattered across the countryside. The sheriff glanced at it once, maybe twice, but with dozens of barns, cellars, and abandoned houses to check, the shed became just another overlooked shadow. Looking back, that was the first mistake. The second mistake was the assumption. The sheriff believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that the boys had drowned or run off. It was easier, safer, to cling to those explanations. Abductions, murders, sinister possibilities, those things belonged to cities, not to his quiet county. So the investigation leaned toward the familiar. The river was searched again and again, until the volunteers grew weary and resentful. Posters were sent to nearby towns in case the boys had hitched a ride. Deputies patrolled highways, checking rest stops and diners. Weeks turned into months, and still, nothing. The mother grew desperate, calling the sheriff daily, begging for updates. Each time, his voice grew softer, his answers shorter. The father grew angrier, accusing the sheriff of giving up. Tensions flared, shouts echoed in the small office more than once. But no matter how many times the sheriff swore he hadn't stopped looking, the truth was clear. The trail had gone cold. By autumn, the case was floundering. Leads had dried up. Deputies were reassigned to other duties. The sheriff stopped carrying the worn notebook. And in that silence, the rumors filled the void. Whispers about the parents persisted. Some thought the father's temper might have boiled over. Others speculated about accidents covered up, about secrets buried. The family felt the weight of those suspicions everywhere they went, even as they grieved. But the sheriff, for all his mistakes, never accused them. He carried the burden quietly. The image of two boys with fishing poles burned into his mind. He patrolled the county roads at night, headlights sweeping over ditches, half hoping to see something, half dreading what that something might be. Years later, when asked about the case, he admitted the truth. "We searched everywhere we knew to look," he said, his voice breaking with age, "but we didn't search everywhere." The shed stood waiting, its lock rusted, its boards grayed, its secret sealed tighter with every passing season. And the investigation, despite the community's desperation, slowly ground to a halt. By the time winter came, the flyers had curled at the edges and blown from telephone poles. People stopped gathering for vigils. The sheriff stopped answering the phone after dark. The brothers' names, once spoken constantly, became quieter. A town can only live with panic for so long before it settles into silence. But the family never stopped. Not really. And as the years turned to decades, the memory of that failed investigation would linger like a wound that never healed. Because the answers had been there all along, just locked away behind a door no one dared to open. When certainty vanishes, rumor takes its place. And after the sheriff's investigation slowed to a crawl, the town's hunger for answers grew restless. By the fall of 1966, the whispers had spread from porches and church pews to the barber shop, the diner, and the schoolyard. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a story they claimed to remember. And every single one only deepened the sense that something unspeakable had taken root in their quiet town. The first rumors clung to the familiar: accidents. Some said the brothers had drowned in the river, their bodies carried downstream to some hidden bend where no one could find them. Parents shuddered at the thought, forbidding their children from going near the water alone. Others pointed to the old quarry, its black depths swallowing anyone foolish enough to swim too close. The quarry had a reputation already, a place where kids dared each other to jump from cliffs and where tragedies had happened before. It was easy to imagine the brothers sneaking there and never returning. But there was no proof, no bodies, no clothing, nothing. That absence fed darker talk. The idea of a stranger prowling the town crept in. People swore they'd seen a man in a truck parked by the edge of the woods days before the boys disappeared. Some said he was offering candy. Others claimed he asked for directions. No one could agree on his face, or even the color of the truck. But in every version, he lingered too long, smiled too wide. The sheriff chased down the lead half-heartedly, but no one ever identified such a man. Then the theories grew stranger. Old-timers muttered about the woods being cursed. They spoke of lights seen at night, of strange noises that didn't sound like animals. One farmer swore he saw figures moving between the trees long after midnight, though when he ran out with his rifle, the clearing was empty. And then came the talk of cults. It wasn't unusual in the 60s for people to whisper about secret groups, strange rituals happening out of sight. A story spread that the brothers had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see, a gathering in the woods, men in robes, chanting. Some said they were sacrificed. Others claimed they were taken to be raised in secrecy by those very cultists. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling, fueled by fear and imagination. The more outlandish theories took hold with surprising ease. One woman insisted the boys had been taken by UFOs. She swore she'd seen lights hovering above the fields that very night, silent and bright, before shooting off into the sky. Children repeated her story with wide eyes, pointing up at the stars and wondering if their friends were now among them, carried off to another world. Another rumor claimed the devil himself walked the town that summer, wearing the face of an ordinary man. The old women at church clucked their tongues, saying the heat wave had been a sign that evil had taken advantage of unlocked doors and trusting hearts. For the boys' parents, these rumors were salt in an open wound. The mother couldn't step into town without hearing her children's names twisted into speculation, their fate discussed as though it were some ghost story to pass the time. The father grew angrier, fists clenched, teeth grinding as he overheard men at the mill debating whether his sons had run off or been taken by something darker. But rumors, once released, cannot be called back. They seeped into the fabric of the town, changing the way people looked at the woods, the river, even each other. Children dared each other to run to the edge of the abandoned property where the locked shed stood. They swore it was haunted, that the brothers were inside, still alive but trapped, calling faintly for help. Some said if you pressed your ear against the wood, you could hear knocking. Most never lasted long enough to try. The shed became a fixture in their ghost stories, even though no adult seemed to pay it any mind. For the children, though, it loomed larger with every retelling. Years passed, but the rumors didn't fade. They only shifted, adapted. New families moved in, heard fragments of the story, and added their own twists. Teenagers told each other the boys had been killed and buried under the floor of an old barn. Others said their bicycles were chained at the bottom of the quarry, rusting away. A few swore the shed wasn't empty at all, that something inside was keeping watch, waiting. The truth remained hidden. But the power of rumor was undeniable. It kept the brothers alive in memory, but twisted. They became legends, symbols of everything that could go wrong in a place that had once felt safe. They were no longer just two boys who vanished. They were cautionary tales. Don't wander off, or you'll end up like them. Stay out of the woods, or the same thing will happen to you. The rumors turned their absence into a shadow that stretched across generations. And yet, behind all the wild theories, the shed still stood, silent, locked, waiting. Time is a strange thing when you're waiting for someone who never comes home. In the weeks after the brothers disappeared, the family's house was a hub of noise, neighbors bringing casseroles, deputies knocking at the door with updates, however small, reporters calling, their voices flat but eager. For a while, the chaos gave the family something to hold on to, a distraction, a sense of motion. But eventually, the noise faded. By the end of that first year, the casseroles stopped coming. The deputies stopped knocking. Reporters moved on to other tragedies, and the house fell quiet. Too quiet. Their bedroom remained exactly as it had been the morning they walked out the door. The striped shirt lay folded at the foot of one bed. The unraveling red one hung from a nail on the wall. Comic books sat stacked on the dresser, a marble glinting in the corner where it had rolled and never been retrieved. Their mother dusted those things every week, hands trembling, whispering apologies to the silence. She never let dust settle, never let the room feel abandoned. In her heart, it wasn't a memorial. It was a place waiting for their return. She marked their birthdays every year, baked cakes, sometimes small, sometimes grander when her grief overwhelmed her. The candles flickered in the dark kitchen, her tears catching the flame as she whispered wishes that never came true. Some years she invited family. Other years she sat alone, staring at the empty chairs. Their father coped differently. He poured himself into work at the mill, taking extra shifts, breaking his back in silence. He never set foot in their bedroom again. To him, going in there felt like tearing open a wound that refused to heal. Instead, he carried his grief like a stone in his pocket, heavy, unspoken, but always there. As the years passed, the The strain grew between them. Grief is cruel like that. For some, it binds. For others, it creates distance. They loved each other still, but the house felt divided, one half clinging to the past, the other trying to bury it beneath long hours and exhaustion. Conversations dwindled, replaced by sighs, by silence, by unspoken resentment. The town, too, began to move on. By the 70s, new families had arrived, people who hadn't known the brothers personally. The missing boys became a story told in passing, something whispered to newcomers with a shake of the head. Flyers long since faded, newspaper clippings yellowed in scrapbooks. For the parents, the world felt cruel, as if everyone else had turned the page while they were still trapped in the same chapter. And yet, the story never vanished completely. Children still told it as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the woods at night, whispering about cults and kidnappers. The shed at the edge of town was still avoided, still locked, its presence a silent reminder that some secrets never fade. But for the family, it wasn't folklore. It was life. The mother kept journals, pages upon pages filled with memories, dreams, prayers. She wrote letters addressed to her sons, letters she never mailed but stored in a box under her bed. Some were tender, describing the garden in bloom, or the dog's silly habits. Others were raw, filled with rage at the silence, at God, at the world that had swallowed them whole. The father carried his grief differently. Over time, it hardened into something like bitterness. He still searched, sometimes alone, walking the fields at night with his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon as though the answers might still be out there. But each fruitless search carved another line into his face, another weight into his chest. Their marriage strained under the pressure. Arguments erupted over small things, the dinner left uneaten, the bills unpaid, but everyone knew the real cause simmered beneath. By the late 70s, they spoke less than they ever had, their words worn down by years of pain. The 80s came and went. The mother grew older, her hair silvering, her face etched with grief she carried like a second skin. Still she marked birthdays, still she dusted the boys' room, still she clung to hope. The father, by then, had grown quiet, his health failing from years of labor and stress. He rarely spoke of the boys anymore, but when he did, his voice cracked in a way that broke her heart all over again. In the 90s, when national television shows began highlighting cold cases, the family reached out. For a brief moment, the boys' story was told to a wider audience. Cameras filmed the farmhouse, the parents sitting stiffly on their couch, clutching photographs worn soft at the edges. The episode aired once, drawing letters of sympathy from strangers, but no leads came. No miracle phone calls, just more silence. The new millennium arrived, and the world seemed unrecognizable. But in that farmhouse, little had changed. The boys' room still waited, untouched. The shed still stood, locked and ignored. The family, now older and more fragile, still carried the same absence. The mother often sat on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon, whispering their names like a prayer. Neighbors said they saw her lips move but never heard a sound. The father, before he passed, left little behind but calloused hands and quiet sorrow. He died without answers, and that truth weighed heavy on the mother's heart. She lived on, her body slowing, her hair white as snow, her eyes still searching. People said she never stopped believing they'd come home. Even when others gave up, even when the town forgot, she held on. And still, year after year, the shed stood at the edge of the abandoned property. Seasons turned its boards gray, vines crawled across its walls, the lock rusted deeper. Children became parents, parents became grandparents. Generations passed, but the secret inside remained untouched. The long years stretched into decades. The story of the brothers shifted into folklore, into legend. But for those who remembered, the ache never dulled. And then, nearly 60 years later, the lock was finally broken. The property sat at the farthest edge of the county line, where the fields gave way to woods, and the road narrowed until it seemed to forget where it was going. For most people, it was a place you passed without noticing, a patch of overgrowth and sagging fences, unremarkable and easily ignored. But for those who knew the story of the brothers, the property carried a weight that was hard to explain. The shed was the centerpiece. It wasn't large, no bigger than a single-room cabin, with weathered boards and a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired spine. Its single door faced the fields, its windows covered with nailed planks that had turned gray with age. A heavy lock hung from the hasp, rust creeping across the metal, stubbornly holding its grip through decades of rain and snow. Children swore the shed was haunted. They told each other it was a prison, that the brothers were locked inside, their spirits still rattling the boards when the wind blew. Some said you could hear knocking if you pressed your ear to the door. Others swore a shadow passed in front of the boarded windows, even though no light could seep through. The adults dismissed these tales with nervous laughter, but most gave the shed a wide berth just the same. The land itself had a strange history. Originally, it belonged to a farmer named Wilkes, a recluse who kept to himself. He was an odd figure, tall and thin, with a habit of muttering under his breath when he came into town for supplies. Children ran from him, and even grown men admitted there was something unsettling in the way he stared just a beat too long. Still, he never caused trouble, and in a small town, that was enough. Wilkes died suddenly in the early 70s, alone in his farmhouse. Some said it was a stroke. Others claimed he simply wasted away, refusing to eat or speak in his final days. His body wasn't discovered for nearly a week, found slumped in his chair by a cousin who came to check on him. The shed became a fixture in their ghost stories, even though no adult seemed to pay it any mind. For the children, though, it loomed larger with every retelling. Years passed, but the rumors didn't fade. They only shifted, adapted. New families moved in, heard fragments of the story, and added their own twists. Teenagers told each other the boys had been killed and buried under the floor of an old barn. Others said their bicycles were chained at the bottom of the quarry, rusting away. A few swore the shed wasn't empty at all, that something inside was keeping watch, waiting. The truth remained hidden. But the power of rumor was undeniable. It kept the brothers alive in memory, but twisted. They became legends, symbols of everything that could go wrong in a place that had once felt safe. They were no longer just two boys who vanished. They were cautionary tales. Don't wander off, or you'll end up like them. Stay out of the woods, or the same thing will happen to you. The rumors turned their absence into a shadow that stretched across generations. And yet, behind all the wild theories, the shed still stood, silent, locked, waiting. Time is a strange thing when you're waiting for someone who never comes home. In the weeks after the brothers disappeared, the family's house was a hub of noise, neighbors bringing casseroles, deputies knocking at the door with updates, however small, reporters calling, their voices flat but eager. For a while, the chaos gave the family something to hold on to, a distraction, a sense of motion. But eventually, the noise faded. By the end of that first year, the casseroles stopped coming. The deputies stopped knocking. Reporters moved on to other tragedies, and the house fell quiet. Too quiet. Their bedroom remained exactly as it had been the morning they walked out the door. The striped shirt lay folded at the foot of one bed. The unraveling red one hung from a nail on the wall. Comic books sat stacked on the dresser, a marble glinting in the corner where it had rolled and never been retrieved. Their mother dusted those things every week, hands trembling, whispering apologies to the silence. She never let dust settle, never let the room feel abandoned. In her heart, it wasn't a memorial. It was a place waiting for their return. She marked their birthdays every year, baked cakes, sometimes small, sometimes grander when her grief overwhelmed her. The candles flickered in the dark kitchen, her tears catching the flame as she whispered wishes that never came true. Some years she invited family. Other years she sat alone, staring at the empty chairs. Their father coped differently. He poured himself into work at the mill, taking extra shifts, breaking his back in silence. He never set foot in their bedroom again. To him, going in there felt like tearing open a wound that refused to heal. Instead, he carried his grief like a stone in his pocket, heavy, unspoken, but always there. As the years passed, the strain grew between them. Grief is cruel like that. For some, it binds. For others, it creates distance. They loved each other still, but the house felt divided, one half clinging to the past, the other trying to bury it beneath long hours and exhaustion. Conversations dwindled, replaced by sighs, by silence, by unspoken resentment. The town, too, began to move on. By the 70s, new families had arrived, people who hadn't known the brothers personally. The missing boys became a story told in passing, something whispered to newcomers with a shake of the head. Flyers long since faded, newspaper clippings yellowed in scrapbooks. For the parents, the world felt cruel, as if everyone else had turned the page while they were still trapped in the same chapter. And yet, the story never vanished completely. Children still told it as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the woods at night, whispering about cults and kidnappers. The shed at the edge of town was still avoided, still locked, its presence a silent reminder that some secrets never fade. But for the family, it wasn't folklore. It was life. The mother kept journals, pages upon pages filled with memories, dreams, prayers. She wrote letters addressed to her sons, letters she never mailed but stored in a box under her bed. Some were tender, describing the garden in bloom, or the dog's silly habits. Others were raw, filled with rage at the silence, at God, at the world that had swallowed them whole. The father carried his grief differently. Over time, it hardened into something like bitterness. He still searched, sometimes alone, walking the fields at night with his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon as though the answers might still be out there. But each fruitless search carved another line into his face, another weight into his chest. Their marriage strained under the pressure. Arguments erupted over small things, the dinner left uneaten, the bills unpaid, but everyone knew the real cause simmered beneath. By the late 70s, they spoke less than they ever had, their words worn down by years of pain. The 80s came and went. The mother grew older, her hair silvering, her face etched with grief she carried like a second skin. Still she marked birthdays, still she dusted the boys' room, still she clung to hope. The father, by then, had grown quiet, his health failing from years of labor and stress. He rarely spoke of the boys anymore, but when he did, his voice cracked in a way that broke her heart all over again. In the 90s, when national television shows began highlighting cold cases, the family reached out. For a brief moment, the boys' story was told to a wider audience. Cameras filmed the farmhouse, the parents sitting stiffly on their couch, clutching photographs worn soft at the edges. The episode aired once, drawing letters of sympathy from strangers, but no leads came. No miracle phone calls, just more silence. The new millennium arrived, and the world seemed unrecognizable. But in that farmhouse, little had changed. The boys' room still waited, untouched. The shed still stood, locked and ignored. The family, now older and more fragile, still carried the same absence. The mother often sat on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon, whispering their names like a prayer. Neighbors said they saw her lips move but never heard a sound. The father, before he passed, left little behind but calloused hands and quiet sorrow. He died without answers, and that truth weighed heavy on the mother's heart. She lived on, her body slowing, her hair white as snow, her eyes still searching. People said she never stopped believing they'd come home. Even when others gave up, even when the town forgot, she held on. And still, year after year, the shed stood at the edge of the abandoned property. Seasons turned its boards gray, vines crawled across its walls, the lock rusted deeper. Children became parents, parents became grandparents. Generations passed, but the secret inside remained untouched. The long years stretched into decades. The story of the brothers shifted into folklore, into legend. But for those who remembered, the ache never dulled. And then, nearly 60 years later, the lock was finally broken. The property sat at the farthest edge of the county line, where the fields gave way to woods, and the road narrowed until it seemed to forget where it was going. For most people, it was a place you passed without noticing, a patch of overgrowth and sagging fences, unremarkable and easily ignored. But for those who knew the story of the brothers, the property carried a weight that was hard to explain. The shed was the centerpiece. It wasn't large, no bigger than a single-room cabin, with weathered boards and a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired spine. Its single door faced the fields, its windows covered with nailed planks that had turned gray with age. A heavy lock hung from the hasp, rust creeping across the metal, stubbornly holding its grip through decades of rain and snow. Children swore the shed was haunted. They told each other it was a prison, that the brothers were locked inside, their spirits still rattling the boards when the wind blew. Some said you could hear knocking if you pressed your ear to the door. Others swore a shadow passed in front of the boarded windows, even though no light could seep through. The adults dismissed these tales with nervous laughter, but most gave the shed a wide berth just the same. The land itself had a strange history. Originally, it belonged to a farmer named Wilkes, a recluse who kept to himself. He was an odd figure, tall and thin, with a habit of muttering under his breath when he came into town for supplies. Children ran from him, and even grown men admitted there was something unsettling in the way he stared just a beat too long. Still, he never caused trouble, and in a small town, that was enough. Wilkes died suddenly in the early 70s, alone in his farmhouse. Some said it was a stroke. Others claimed he simply wasted away, refusing to eat or speak in his final days. His body wasn't discovered for nearly a week, found slumped in his chair by a cousin who came to check on him. After his death, the property passed through hands like a cursed heirloom. His relatives sold it cheap to a family from the next county over, but they barely lasted 2 years before moving away. They claimed the soil was poor, the farmhouse impossible to maintain, but neighbors whispered they left because of the shed. The family's eldest daughter reportedly told her classmates she saw figures moving around it at night, though no one ever proved such a thing. After that, the property sat empty for long stretches. It was rented once or twice, but tenants never stayed. The farmhouse fell into disrepair. Windows shattered, the roof caved in. Vines crawled up its sides until it looked like the forest was reclaiming it. The shed, though, remained curiously intact. By the 90s, it had become something of a landmark, the place teenagers dared each other to approach, the backdrop for ghost stories told around bonfires. Even those who didn't believe in the supernatural felt a chill when they passed it. No one ever broke the lock. That fact puzzled many in later years. Why didn't someone, a child, a vagrant, a curious passerby, ever pry it open? Some believed it was fear, an unspoken agreement that whatever lay inside was better left undisturbed. Others thought it was simply neglect, the shed so forgotten it faded from notice except in whispers. But the lock held, season after season, decade after decade. And all the while, the family of the missing boys carried their grief, never knowing that the answer sat hidden behind that door. The town grew, changed, moved on. New developments rose closer to the county line. Roads were paved, fields were sold. But the property lingered, untouched, a stubborn scar on the edge of progress. In the 2000s, there was talk of demolishing the farmhouse and clearing the land. A developer bought the property at auction, planning to cut it into parcels. But paperwork stalled, ownership changed again, and the shed remained. Some said the paperwork trouble was itself a sign that fate, or something darker, was conspiring to keep the shed closed. Others simply shook their heads and said it was bad luck. And so it sat, boarded, and locked, its secrets sealed tighter with each passing year. By the time 2024 came, the shed had been standing silent for nearly 60 years. The boards were soft with rot, the roof sagged lower, but the lock still clung stubbornly in place. It was a county worker, tasked with clearing the overgrown property, who finally brought it down. His crowbar pried at the rusted clasp, his boots crunching over weeds that had grown chest-high. He said later that the lock resisted, squealing like something alive before it gave way. The doors creaked open, spilling dust and stale air into the sunlight. And in that moment, the decades of rumor, grief, and silence cracked wide open. The shed had kept its secret long enough. The morning the shed was opened was nothing remarkable on its surface. It was October, the air crisp with the first bite of fall, leaves crunching underfoot. A crew from the county had been sent to clear the overgrown property, to ready it for eventual sale. The farmhouse was too far gone, its roof caved in, its windows shattered, but the shed still stood, stubborn against time. The worker who approached it later admitted he almost skipped it. It looked like nothing, just another outbuilding, sagging, gray, swallowed by vines. But the lock caught his eye, heavy, old, rusted. Locks mean someone once wanted to keep something in, or keep something out. He radioed his supervisor. They agreed it needed to be opened, if only to make sure it wasn't a hazard. So, with little ceremony, he wedged the end of his crowbar under the clasp and pushed. The metal screamed, flakes of rust showering his boots. The lock groaned, then snapped. For the first time in nearly 60 years, the door creaked open. At first, nothing dramatic greeted them. Just a wall of stale air, thick and sour, the smell of damp wood and mildew. Dust motes spun in the light that pierced through the crack. Cobwebs hung like curtains. But as the door opened wider, the smell deepened. It wasn't just mildew, it was sharper, metallic, sour, the kind of smell that clings in the back of your throat, that makes your stomach twist. The worker gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve. He stepped inside anyway, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp. Old tools lay scattered in corners, a rusted saw, a cracked bucket, coils of wire. For a moment, it looked like any forgotten shed. Then the beam of his light caught something else. In the far corner, beneath a mound of debris, was a shape, small at first glance, like a bundle of rags. But the longer he stared, the less it looked like rags at all. He called for backup. His supervisor came, then the sheriff's department. By the time the deputies arrived, word had already spread. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, craning their necks, whispering to each other as patrol cars pulled up. Inside, the deputies cleared the debris carefully, their gloves brushing away decades of dust and rot. What they uncovered stopped them cold. Bones. Not one set, but two. Side by side, curled as though the bodies had been forced into that corner. The smaller frame leaned slightly against the larger, as if even in death the brothers had clung to one another. The room fell silent, save for the scuffle of boots and the crackle of radios. For nearly 6 decades, the town had wondered, speculated, whispered, and here, in this forgotten shed, lay the answer no one had wanted but everyone had feared. The sheriff stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face pale. He wasn't the same man from 1966 that sheriff had long since passed, but he carried the weight of the office. And he knew, in that moment, that the town's longest nightmare had just resurfaced. News spread fast. Within hours, the property was swarming. Crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind. Forensics teams in white suits moved in and out, their voices low, their faces grave. Cameras from local news stations lined the road. And at the center of it all, that shed stood like a monument to silence. The discovery was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, a blow that rippled across generations. For those who remembered the summer of 1966, the images of the boys' faces on old flyers came rushing back, sharper than ever. For their mother, now frail and in her twilight years, it was both a relief and a devastation. She had lived nearly 60 years with no answers. Now she had them, but the cost was unbearable. The investigators moved slowly, carefully. Every bone was cataloged, every scrap of cloth collected. The corner of the shed was photographed from every angle. And though the decades had eroded much, the truth still lingered in those remains. The brothers had not run away. They had not drowned. They had been hidden in plain sight. The town reeled. Some wept openly in the streets. Others grew angry, demanding to know how such a place had been overlooked for so long. Theories swirled all over again, but now they had something solid to anchor to. The shed had kept its secret for nearly 6 decades, but secrets never stay buried forever. And now the question was no longer what happened to the brothers. The question was who put them there. When the shed doors opened in 2024, the discovery of the remains was only the beginning. For investigators, the question shifted immediately from what to who. Who had brought the brothers here? Who had locked the door and walked away, leaving them hidden in the dark for nearly 6 decades? The forensics team set to work. Though the years had stripped away flesh, bones still carried stories. The smaller skeleton was hunched, leaning against the larger. Both showed signs of trauma. Forensic anthropologists noted fractures that were unlikely to be accidental. Old cloth clung stubbornly to the remains, faded but still distinguishable. One shirt was striped. The other, a dull red, its hem unraveled. The clothing matched exactly what the mother had described the day her sons vanished. Further examination revealed something else. Rusted nails scattered the dirt floor, but a set of chains lay nearby too, corroded but unmistakable. They hadn't simply wandered in, they had been confined. The air inside the shed told another story. Soil samples confirmed traces of human decomposition absorbed deep into the ground. It was clear, this was not a place of rest, it was a place of captivity. The sheriff's office reopened the case officially, the file pulled from dusty archives where it had lain forgotten for decades. The old notebooks, brittle flyers, yellowed photographs, they were laid out once more on desks. Deputies who hadn't even been born when the boys vanished now found themselves responsible for solving one of the county's oldest wounds. The first step was tracing the property. Records showed that in 1966, the land belonged to a man named Wilkes, the same reclusive farmer the town had whispered about for years. He died a few years later. His estate passed down to distant relatives who sold it off. But in 1966, he was very much alive. Neighbors remembered him only vaguely. He kept to himself, rarely speaking more than a few words at the feed store. Children had been afraid of him, but no one could ever put their finger on why. He was just strange. The kind of man you cross the street to avoid, but didn't accuse of anything more sinister than muttering to himself. Now, with fresh eyes, investigators saw things differently. Wilkes lived alone. He had a shed that no one was ever allowed near. He had the means and opportunity, and he lived barely a mile from where the boys were last seen. But Wilkes was long gone, his secrets buried with him. That didn't stop investigators. They dug deeper, into old police notes, into overlooked witness statements. One stood out: a farmhand who had once mentioned seeing the boys near the edge of Wilkes's property. At the time, it had been dismissed as just another unreliable memory. Now it seemed chillingly important. Interviews with surviving townsfolk painted a picture of Wilkes as more than just odd. Some recalled hearing screams near his land late at night. Others swore they'd seen him hauling heavy bundles into the shed. No one had spoken up at the time, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of disbelief. But hindsight sharpened those recollections into something darker. The investigation also uncovered records from the 70s, when Wilkes's relatives inherited the property. One cousin, in a letter discovered in probate files, described the land as unclean and the shed as a place I will not enter. That letter had been forgotten for decades, but now it glowed like a warning. Forensics, records, testimony, piece by piece, the picture formed. The brothers hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been lured, or forced, into that shed, and someone almost certainly Wilkes had locked the door behind them. The why was harder. Some speculated Wilkes had been driven by madness. Others believed he had darker urges, the kind people rarely spoke of aloud. Whatever the motive, the act itself was undeniable. The shed wasn't just where the boys were found. It was where their lives had ended. As investigators reconstructed the scene, the weight of history pressed down on the town. Reporters returned, their cameras capturing the farmhouse ruins, the shed with its doors now gaping open, the yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Old wounds reopened. Families who had long buried the story found themselves telling it again, voices trembling as though no time had passed at all. For the mother, now elderly and frail, the revelation was both answer and agony. She sat in her living room, clutching a worn photograph of her boys, tears streaming down her lined face. "I knew they didn't run," she whispered. "I knew someone took them." The truth had come, but late. Too late for her husband, too late for decades of grief that might have been different had answers come sooner. Still, there was a grim kind of closure. The brothers had been found, their story had been uncovered, and the man who had kept them hidden, though dead and beyond earthly justice, had finally been named. Yet even with the pieces assembled, one haunting detail remained. Why had no one ever opened the shed? How had dozens of searchers, deputies, neighbors, and even later owners passed it by, never breaking that rusted lock? It was as if the shed itself had conspired to keep it secret, waiting until time and chance finally broke it open. The investigators closed their notebooks with heavy hands. The case was declared solved, but not settled. Some mysteries never are. The brothers were laid to rest properly at last, their names etched in stone, their memory honored in a way that had been denied for decades. The town gathered for the service, candles flickering, the silence deep and reverent. But even as the crowd dispersed, one truth lingered. The shed had held them all these years, and though its door now hung open, its shadow stretched still across the town. The funeral was small, but the crowd spilled out of the chapel doors. Nearly 60 years had passed since the brothers vanished, but time hadn't erased them. Some who gathered were old now, gray-haired and frail, remembering the boys as classmates, neighbors, cousins. Others were too young to remember at all, but they'd grown up hearing the story, their childhoods shaped by whispered warnings of what had happened that summer. The caskets were small, far smaller than anyone had imagined carrying into a church in the year 2024. The remains inside were only fragments, bones pieced together from the shed's dirt floor. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the brothers were finally home. The mother sat in the front pew, her hands folded tightly around a photograph worn from decades of being held. Her face was thin, her body frail, but her eyes were fierce, with something like peace or perhaps exhaustion. She had carried hope for so long that even grief felt like release. When the service ended, the town filed quietly past. Some left flowers, others left folded notes. One man, now in his 70s, whispered an apology as he touched the edge of a coffin. He had been part of the original search party in 1966. He had walked past that shed, had seen the lock, had chosen not to pry. The guilt had stayed with him all his life. The brothers were buried side by side, their names etched into a single stone. The wind carried the sound of church bells as the last shovelfuls of earth were laid. For the first time in nearly 60 years, their resting place was marked, no longer lost, no longer hidden. But closure is never simple. The town felt relief, yes, but it also felt anger. Anger at the failure of the original investigation. Anger that the shed had been overlooked again and again. Anger that the answers had been there all along, just behind a locked door. For some, the story became proof of something larger, that evil doesn't always come with warning, that it can live quietly, on the edge of town, disguised in the routines of ordinary life. The property was finally cleared not long after. The farmhouse was torn down, the weeds cut away. But the shed remained. The county debated demolishing it, but voices rose in protest. Some wanted it destroyed, erased, so no one would ever have to look at it again. Others argued it should stand as a memorial, a reminder of the brothers and of the silence that had lasted so long. In the end, the shed stayed. Its doors stood open now, the lock gone, the secrets inside exposed to the daylight. A plaque was placed at its entrance, bearing the brothers' names. People came to leave flowers, toys, handwritten notes. Children who had once whispered ghost stories now stood quietly beside their parents, learning the real one. The mother lived long enough to see it. She visited often, her steps slow, her hand steady on her cane. She would sit on a small bench nearby, watching the shed with eyes that seemed to see beyond it. When she passed a few years later, she was buried beside her husband, and not far from her sons. The family, fractured by grief for decades, was together again at last. Still, the story lingered. People spoke of the discovery with awe and unease. They shook their heads, saying it was fate, that the shed had waited until the right moment to reveal its truth. Some even said the land itself had held the secret until it could no longer bear the weight. But there was one detail that continued to haunt. When investigators cataloged the shed, they found not just bones and chains, but something else. Scratched into the wooden boards, faint but still legible after all these years, were marks. At first they looked like nothing random grooves from tools or nails, but under the forensic lights, they became clear. Initials. 2 sets. The older brothers, carved higher, shaky but deliberate. The younger brothers, smaller, beneath it, side by side, etched into the wall of the shed. They had left a message, however small. Proof that they had been there. Proof that, even in their final hours, they had been together. That discovery broke the town's heart all over again. The initials remain visible to this day, preserved under a thin layer of protective glass. People who visit the shed often pause before them, tracing the outlines with their eyes, imagining the small, desperate hands that carved them. It is closure, yes, but it is also a reminder, a whisper from the past that refuses to fade. And sometimes, late at night, people say you can still hear it. If you stand at the edge of the property, if the wind is right, you can hear the faint sound of knocking from inside the shed. As if the brothers' voices still linger, reminding the world that for nearly 60 years, no one opened the door. Even with answers, some mysteries never close. The town had its closure. The brothers had been laid to rest, their story finally told. The mother passed in peace, reunited with her family. The property was cleared, the shed preserved as a memorial. But the leftover details still haunt those who know the case. The initials carved into the wall remain the most devastating, a final message from 2 boys who refused to vanish into silence. People say if you press your hand against the boards, you can almost feel the grooves beneath the glass, as though their presence lingers in the wood itself. Visitors have also reported strange things. A chill that cuts through even on hot summer days, the faint sound of children's laughter drifting through the weeds. Some swear they've heard knocking from inside, though the shed now stands open and empty. Skeptics dismiss it as imagination, as nerves, but others believe the land remembers, that for nearly 60 years, the secret was kept too long, and its echoes will never leave. The brothers' story ended in that shed, but their voices remain in the town's memory, and maybe that's the point. Some tragedies don't vanish with time, they stay, They linger. They remind us. Because when two brothers vanished in 1966, the entire town changed forever. And 58 years later, when the shed was finally opened, the truth emerged, but so did the ghosts.